On the night of April 14th, 1912, the largest ship ever built struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. 2 hours and 40 minutes later, it was gone. More than 1,500 people died. And for over a century, the world has asked the same question: how did this happen? The answer most people know goes something like this. A massive, supposedly unsinkable ship hit an iceberg and sank. The crew was arrogant. The company was greedy. The lifeboats were too few. End of story. But that version is incomplete. Because what actually happened that night was not a single catastrophic failure. It was a chain of decisions, engineering compromises, material limitations, and operational errors, each one individually survivable, but together, lethal. To understand why Titanic sank, you have to understand every link in that chain. Let's start with the numbers, because the scale of this vessel matters. RMS Titanic had a length of 269 meters and a beam of 28 meters. Its gross tonnage was approximately 46,328 tons. At the time of its launch in 1911, it was the largest movable man-made object ever constructed. Its top speed was around 23 knots, roughly 43 kilometers per hour. It carried 2,224 people on its maiden voyage, passengers and crew combined. The ship was designed with 16 watertight compartments, separated by bulkheads running across the width of the hull. The designers calculated that Titanic could remain afloat with any 2 compartments flooded, or with the first 4 compartments flooded simultaneously. This was considered an extraordinary safety margin for the era. It was this design feature, more than anything else, that gave rise to the phrase, practically unsinkable. A phrase used in a trade publication, not by the builders themselves, but one that stuck. The iceberg was sighted at 11:40 p.m. ship's time. The ship struck it 37 seconds later. In those 37 seconds, the lookout sounded the alarm, and the officer on the bridge ordered a hard turn to port and engines to full reverse. The bow swung left, but not fast enough. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side for approximately 90 meters below the waterline. Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. Total elapsed time from impact to sinking, 2 hours and 40 minutes. Now let's look at what most people get wrong. The most persistent misconception about the Titanic disaster is that the iceberg tore open a massive gash in the hull, a single dramatic cut that doomed the ship instantly. That is not what happened. When the wreck was surveyed in detail in the 1990s using sonar and remote imaging, researchers found no large gash. What they found instead was a series of small openings, thin slits and separated seams, running along approximately 90 meters of the starboard hull across 6 compartments. The total area of those openings has been estimated at roughly 1.1 to 1.2 square meters. That is less than the area of 2 standard doors. The iceberg didn't cut through the steel plates. It bent them inward, popped rivets, and opened seams between the hull plates. Water entered not through a dramatic tear, but through multiple small gaps distributed across a wide section of the hull. This distinction is critical because it changes the entire engineering analysis of what failed and why. The first engineering failure was in the rivets. When Titanic was built, the hull plates were joined together using iron and steel rivets. Metal pins heated until red hot, inserted through pre-drilled holes in overlapping plates, and hammered flat on both sides to create a permanent joint. The quality and composition of those rivets determined how the hull behaved under stress. In the midsection of the ship, where the shipyard's hydraulic riveting machines could reach, steel rivets of good quality were used. But at the bow and stern, where the hull curves made machine access difficult, the rivets were driven by hand. And researchers who analyzed samples of Titanic's rivets recovered from the wreck found that the iron rivets used in those sections had a significantly elevated slag content. Slag is a byproduct of iron production. In small amounts, it's normal. In high concentrations, it makes the metal brittle, less able to deform under stress, and more likely to fracture suddenly. The bow section which struck the iceberg was fastened with high slag iron rivets. When the iceberg applied lateral force to those joints, the rivet heads didn't bend. They popped. The seams between hull plates opened. Water entered. This was not sabotage. It was not negligence in the simplest sense. It was a material science limitation that was not fully understood in 1912. Metallurgical testing of this kind did not exist as a standard shipbuilding practice. The rivets met the specifications of their time. But those specifications were not sufficient for what happened on that night. The second engineering failure was in the steel itself. Samples of Titanic's hull steel, also recovered from the wreck, have been analyzed extensively by materials scientists. The findings were consistent across multiple studies. The steel used in Titanic's hull had a higher sulfur content than modern shipbuilding steel. High sulfur content reduces ductility, the ability of a material to deform plastically before fracturing. At room temperature, the steel performed within acceptable parameters. But at temperatures near freezing, which is precisely the condition of the North Atlantic in April, the steel's ductility dropped sharply. This phenomenon is called ductile to brittle transition. Below a certain temperature threshold, the steel behaves less like a tough, deformable material and more like a brittle solid. When struck, it cracks rather than bends. The water temperature that night was approximately -2 degrees Celsius, just below freezing, kept liquid by its salt content. The hull steel was operating at or below its ductile to brittle transition temperature. When the iceberg applied impact loading to the hull, sections of steel that might have bent and absorbed energy at warmer temperatures instead fractured. This contributed to the opening of seams and the failure of the hull's integrity along the contact zone. Again, this was not a known risk in 1912. The study of low-temperature embrittlement in structural steel was not part of shipbuilding practice at that time. The steel met its era's standards. Its era's standards were simply not adequate. The third failure was in the watertight compartment design. This is where the engineering analysis becomes most revealing. Titanic's 16 watertight compartments were separated by bulkheads, vertical walls running across the width of the ship. These bulkheads extended upward to various deck levels. But here is the critical design detail. They did not extend all the way to the uppermost decks. They stopped at a height that was considered sufficient based on the flooding scenarios the designers had modeled. When the iceberg opened seams across 6 compartments, one more than the design's maximum tolerable flooding scenario, those 6 compartments began filling with water. As they filled, the bow of the ship sank lower. The water level inside the flooded compartments rose toward the top of the bulkheads, and when it reached that height, it spilled over into the next compartment. This is called progressive flooding. Each compartment that filled added weight to the bow, pulling it lower. As the bow sank, more compartments were exposed to flooding over their bulkhead tops. The process accelerated. The ship's stern rose out of the water. The hull, now unsupported in its midsection, began to experience structural stress far beyond its design limits. At approximately 2:17 a.m., Titanic broke apart between the third and fourth funnels. The bow section sank first, pulling away from the stern. The stern, now flooded and destabilized, sank minutes later. If the bulkheads had extended 2 or 3 decks higher, a modification that was technically feasible and not extraordinarily expensive, the progressive flooding scenario might have been survivable. The designers chose not to extend them, partly for cost reasons, partly because the scenario they faced was considered beyond the design envelope. It wasn't. Now let's move to the human decisions because they are equally important. On April 14, 1912, Titanic received at least 6 ice warnings from other vessels in the area. The messages described field ice and icebergs across the route the ship was sailing. Some of these warnings were posted in the chart room. Some were not formally logged into the navigation record. At least one, received later in the evening, reportedly never reached the bridge. Captain Edward Smith did not reduce speed. Titanic continued at approximately 22 knots through an area that multiple ships had reported as containing ice. This decision is often attributed to arrogance or recklessness. The reality is more nuanced. The practice of maintaining speed in ice-reported waters was not unusual for the era. The prevailing belief, supported by the experience of many voyages, was that a sharp lookout could spot ice in time to maneuver. The assumption was that at 22 knots, with experienced lookouts, the ship could react fast enough. That assumption was wrong for two specific reasons. First, the night of April 14th was unusually calm. In normal conditions, waves breaking against the base of an iceberg create a visible white froth, a foam line that can be seen before the iceberg itself is visible. That night, the ocean was flat. There was no froth. The iceberg was dark, and it was spotted only when it was close enough that evasive action was no longer fully effective. Second, the lookouts did not have binoculars. The binoculars that should have been in the crow's nest had been locked in a storage locker in Southampton, and the key had been taken by an officer who left the ship before departure. This is not a minor detail. Binoculars at that distance and in those light conditions could have provided several additional seconds of warning. Several additional seconds at 22 knots translates to hundreds of meters of reaction distance. Then there is the question of the Californian. At the time Titanic was sinking, another vessel, the SS Californian, was stopped in the ice approximately 20 to 30 kilometers away. Its crew saw lights on the horizon. They saw rockets being fired, the distress signal of the era. The Californian's captain was informed. No action was taken. The wireless operator had gone to sleep for the night. Whether the Californian could have reached Titanic in time to save more lives is disputed. The distance, the ice conditions, and the time required to get underway make the calculation uncertain. But the failure to respond to distress rockets, regardless of the outcome, represented a serious dereliction of duty that compounded the death toll. The ship that did respond was the RMS Carpathia, which received Titanic's wireless distress call and sailed through ice fields at maximum speed, arriving at 4:10 a.m., approximately 1 hour and 50 minutes after Titanic sank. Carpathia rescued 710 survivors. And finally, the lifeboats. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats with a total capacity of 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people on board. Even at full capacity, more than 1,000 people could not have been accommodated. In practice, the lifeboats were launched significantly underfilled, partly due to panic, partly due to poor coordination, partly because many passengers initially refused to board, not yet believing the ship was actually sinking. The lifeboat count was not illegal. British Board of Trade Regulations in 1912 set lifeboat requirements based on ship tonnage, not passenger count. A regulation written decades earlier for much smaller vessels and never updated to reflect the new generation of ocean liners. Titanic actually exceeded the regulatory requirement. White Star Line, the company that owned Titanic, had originally considered installing more lifeboats. The initial design included davits, capable of handling 64 lifeboats. The decision was made to install 20. The reasons included deck space aesthetics, more lifeboats would clutter the first-class promenade deck, and the belief that the ship's watertight compartments made a full complement unnecessary. The ship, after all, was its own lifeboat. That belief, as we now know, was incorrect. So who was responsible? The answer is that responsibility was distributed across every level of the system. The metallurgists who set the standards for rivet and hull steel in 1912 could not have known what low-temperature embrittlement would mean at -2 degrees in the North Atlantic. The naval architects who designed the watertight bulkheads modeled flooding scenarios that seemed comprehensive, but did not include the actual scenario that occurred. These were failures of knowledge, not of intent. The decision not to extend the bulkheads higher was an engineering compromise made under cost and weight constraints. It was a decision that a different set of priorities might have reversed. The decision to carry 20 lifeboats instead of more was a corporate decision made under regulatory, aesthetic, and financial pressures. Both decisions proved fatal. Captain Smith's decision to maintain speed in ice-reported waters reflected the accepted practices of his era, compounded by two factors: the unusual calm that eliminated the normal iceberg warning signs, and the missing binoculars that combined to eliminate the margin his experience had always assumed was sufficient. The Californian's failure to respond to distress rockets was an operational failure with no engineering dimension, simply a failure of duty. What the Titanic disaster ultimately exposed was a system that had optimized for normal conditions and had no adequate answer for the scenario that actually occurred. The ship was designed to survive 4 flooded compartments. It faced 6. The lookouts were trained to spot icebergs. The conditions that night made spotting nearly impossible. The lifeboats were compliant with regulations. The regulations were not designed for ships of that size. Every element of the system was operating within its defined parameters. The disaster occurred in the space between those parameters and reality. After Titanic, the world changed how it thought about maritime safety. The International Ice Patrol was established in 1914 to monitor iceberg positions in North Atlantic shipping lanes. It still operates today. The Safety of Life at Sea Convention, known as SOLAS, was adopted in 1914 and required lifeboat capacity for every person on board. Steel quality standards were revised. Watertight bulkhead requirements were updated. Wireless communication became mandatory on passenger vessels, with 24-hour operator coverage required. Every one of those changes was a direct response to a specific failure mode identified in the Titanic disaster. Each one closed a gap in the system. None of them could bring back the 717 people who died. The engineering lesson of Titanic is not that the ship was badly built. By the standards of 1912, it was exceptionally well built. The lesson is that complex systems fail at the boundaries of their design assumptions, and that the consequences of those failures depend on how much margin existed between the design envelope and reality. In the case of Titanic, that margin was smaller than anyone believed, and on the night of April 14, 1912, reality exceeded it. If this kind of systems-level engineering analysis interests you, I've covered what happens inside a ship's engine room in another video, the machinery that moves 200,000 tons through the water, and what happens when it stops.